Okay, welcome. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sangmani Labut, and I am the program manager at the Institute for Advanced Study. For accessibility, I am an Asian male. I'm wearing a blue shirt with a black background behind me. So the University of Minnesota Spotlight Series is a collaborative partnership of the Institute for Advanced Study, the University Honors Program, and Northrop to present lectures, panel discussions, exhibits, and other events throughout the academic year around timely topics of interest. The six-part 2021 and 22 series, hosted in partnership with the Minnesota Humanities Center, focuses on reconsidering patriotism, public service, and civic engagement. And before we begin, I want to acknowledge that whether you are here on campus or with us online, we are all located on traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of Indigenous people. The University of Minnesota Twin Cities campus resides on Dakota land ceded in the treaties of 1837 and 1851. We acknowledge that this place has a complex and layered history. This land acknowledgement is one of the many ways in which we work to educate the campus and community about this land and our relationship with each other. The IS, Northrop, and the University Honors Program are committed to ongoing efforts to recognize, support, and advocate for American Indian nations and peoples. So it is my pleasure to introduce today's guests. We have Maria Regan Gonzalez, currently serving as the mayor of the city of Richfield, Minnesota, and is also the M Health Fairview's Systems Director of Equity Initiatives. Maria has dedicated her professional experience and personal passion to blending and applying public health practice and community organizing methodologies to transform large mainstream institutions such as local governments and healthcare systems in service to the reduction and elimination of racial and health inequities. As the state's first Latina mayor and as a nonpartisan politician, she is part of a growing movement to change and diversify the face of politics, leadership, and decision making to better hold and represent the complexity of our communities today. Maria is also a proud University of Minnesota graduate for her undergraduate degree in global study and Spanish and her master's in public health. Our next speaker is Bonnie Kristian. Bonnie is an author and journalist. She is also acting editor-in-chief at theweek.com, and her column, The Lesser Kingdom, appears in print and online at Christianity Today. Her work has also appeared in outlets including USA Today, NBC, CNN, the Los Angeles Times, Politico, Time, and Reason. Bonnie's first book, The Flexible Faith, Rethinking What It Means to Follow Jesus Today, was published in 2018. Her second book, forthcoming in this fall of 2022, is Untrustworthy, the knowledge crisis breaking our brains, polluting our politics, and corrupting Christian community. A graduate of Bethel Seminary, she lives in Pittsburgh with her husband and two sons. And the third speaker is C. Daniel Myers. He is the assistant professor of political science here at the University of Minnesota. He studies political communication and political psychology, and particularly as they relate to the polarization and theories of democracy. And so he earned his PhD at Princeton University in 2011 and completed his postdoc work in health policy at the University of Michigan. And Dan will be joining us virtually today. And so please help me welcome our esteemed panelists. So before I get further into our program and hand it off to our speakers, our online viewers can enable captions by creating the closed captions or live transcription button, commonly in the bottom part of your Zoom menu. If you are on a desktop, computer or on the top right menu if you are on a mobile device, and so you can click like show subtitles. And so for today, we will be using a platform called Slido to facilitate audience Q&A. You can submit questions anytime throughout the program. Attendees, both in person as well as virtual, can go to www.slido.com and enter the code Spotlight Series. For folks joining us virtually, there is a link in the chat button as well that you can click on. And so please submit your questions through Slido. It is a 160 character limit. And so we encourage folks to engage with each other that way as well, engage with our speaker through that platform as well. And so now, without further ado, our moderator for today and for the Spotlight series is Kevin Lindsey. Kevin is CEO of the Minnesota Humanities Center. He is a widely respected advocate and lawyer with a wealth of experience in public policy and education reform. A proven changemaker, Kevin's career focuses on finding solutions to complex issues for institutions. He has a passion for inclusion for all, building a stronger democracy, and leveraging the powers of personal stories. And Kevin has held numerous government and nonprofit positions, such as board chair and an interim executive director at Walker West Music Academy. And most recently, he served as commissioner of the Minnesota Department of Human Rights from 2011 to 2019. Thanks, Kevin. Take it away.
Thank you so much. And Dan, it's also good to see you. Appreciate that. So we thought that we would start out within this conversation and give each of our guests a couple of minutes just to kind of introduce themselves and how they are thinking about how they want to approach the conversation with you today. Again, I want to remind the audience, please do send your questions. We're hoping that this will be interactive and that you will have questions for all of our guests. So, Madam Mayor, I am going to start with you first.
Hello, everyone. Looks like this is on. I'm Maria Regan Gonzalez, the proud mayor of Richfield. And this issue of the missing middle and the complexity that we seem to have a lack of ability to hold is the bane of my existence every day as a nonpartisan mayor. And so I have so much experience in that and doing everything I can to hold that middle in spite of every single day, multiple times a day, folks trying to get me to go to one side or the other because it's just, people want to polarize and either you're in our camp or you're in their camp. But not only do I bring that perspective, I'm also a biracial Chicana from the Midwest. My dad is from Mora, Minnesota. I grew up playing ice hockey and going to the cabin in Mille Lacs Lake, but my mom is an immigrant from Mexico City. And so I think that my cultural identity and my identity as a person actually has a lot to do with being able to hold that tension and that complexity. And it's what I am passionate about bringing to our world because I think it's the base of our democracy and what we need to do to keep building it. So that's the perspective I'll be bringing today.
Thank you for that. I just harken back to Commissioner Gonzalez that I served with. So a lot of hockey-playing moms are now crossing my path. So only in Minnesota, right? So Bonnie, if you would introduce yourself and kind of frame the conversation for the audience.
Sure, yeah. Well, as was mentioned, I am the acting editor-in-chief at theweek.com. And if you'll forgive a little bit of promotion of our site, one of the things that we really prioritize is having a diversity of ideological perspectives. So where many sites lean right, lean left, have sort of unspoken third rails of topics you can't discuss or case arguments you can't make, we very deliberately bring in writers who strongly disagree with each other. And as an editor, the way that you serve your writer well, including across sometimes very severe disagreement, is you really have to think about the way they're approaching things and the way they're thinking about this issue and be able to write ideally in their voice and from their perspective as you're tweaking and improving their article. And so that has been a really interesting education for me to think through how people who think about things very differently than I do approach politics. And in my own writing as well, you find out very quickly when you start putting your opinions on the internet that most people probably don't think about things the way that you do, and they let you know that. And so I spend a lot of time thinking about, you know, where the middle actually is. It's usually not where I am, frankly, the way things have been moving in sort of our national political environment these past few years. And so I'm interested in speaking tonight about journalism, media coverage, but certainly also social media and the way that we as like a news audience engage with that stuff and what we expect from our media in this increasingly polarized time.
Thank you so much for that. Dan, I'm going to turn it to you if you want to introduce yourself to the audience.
Hi, thanks everybody, and thanks to the Institute for Advanced Study and Minnesota Humanities Center for inviting me and letting me participate virtually. So I'm a political scientist, and a lot of what we've studied for the last decade or so in my part of political science is trying to figure out how we got to this place where the middle is so missing, and what has happened to produce these sort of contentious, polarized politics that we find ourselves in right now. And I think I approach this question thinking about the middle one in a couple different ways. I think an important question is, what do we mean when we say the middle? Are we talking about the middle in terms of policy, what people want from government? Are we talking about the middle in terms of sort of how engaged people are in politics? Or are we talking about it in terms of a process and a sort of a sense of compromise and listening and engagement with each other? And so I think those are important things to think about as we think about the middle that's missing, and also why we prioritize the middle. I think an important question is, we might have a sort of instinct to think that these things are good, but why? I don't think being in the middle is by itself good. We want to have a reason to think that that is actually the best thing for government to be doing.
Thank you, and I think you've kind of teed it up nicely to come back to, I think what the mayor responded to is kind of the bane of her existence, I think I heard. So I'm curious, when you're thinking about trying to manage the complexity of running a city as a mayor, helping people make choices, how does navigating and trying to find the middle show up?
Here we go. One of the things that I do as mayor, is try to build relationships and trust and consistency and leadership, so that leadership can be trusted across all different constituency groups in my community and folks that I work with. So for example, I'll talk about an approach that, one of the hottest topic issues in our nation, and especially here in the Twin Cities, is police reform. So many people, whether it's police departments, my own police department, police officers, or community members, want me to pick a side, defund the police, or Blue Lives Matter, and that's the approach and that's the type of leadership that they need to see from me. I have not taken that approach. In order to move any type of reform forward, we need to have all parties involved, involved in that process of creating something new, and that you can hold multiple realities and contradiction can be true in that conversation. And so a lot of times what I do in my role is really focus on building trust across many different constituencies, and set the table to have difficult, tension-filled conversations where we can think about recreating something together. But it has to start with that trust building. And so in many ways, I feel like that is a big part of my role as mayor of a city, but also I think that's a part of my personal identity too, is being able to build trust across difference and setting a table and conversation where people can feel heard amongst differing opinions. So that's kind of the approach that I take, and I apply it to the specific policy issues or any issue in my community.
No, I think that sounds like a sensible approach as to a mayor of trying to find that, but that, I tell you, probably doesn't sound as exciting to read about. So Bonnie, I'm going to come to you. this is great the mayor's doing this, but I think I heard you say you like grabbing some folks on one side of an issue and another folks on the other side of the issue and having the fun play out for folks to read, the stark contrast.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, well, I should clarify, we have our centrists too. We have people who write in the middle, if you will, and frequently we'll have, you know, a range of different folks weighing in on a given issue, and you do get a contrast of perspectives, but also like a gradient of perspectives, right? So yeah, I think there are different incentives, right, for media, and that's a challenge. The idea that we need to get attention, we need to get clicks, we need to get views, we need to get subscribers, and unfortunately, the reality is that there's a strong pressure to sensationalize, and there's a strong pressure to make the most exciting version of your argument. And so what we're trying to do, you know, what journalists who are trying to be responsible and make their case, you know, strongly and well without moving into that unduly sensational space, is, you know, finding that balance of making a case in a courageous way, in a way that does not pull punches, but also that does not create controversy for its own sake, that does not, you know, you see pieces sometimes that seem like they're written just to have fights on Twitter. And so steering clear of that is a key challenge to balance like an honest case, but also a case that is collegial and that deals respectfully with views that are very far from yours.
I appreciate that. Dan, you had said something about how we have been moving kind of in our political spectrum. So I'm curious, now that we're in kind of the caucus season here in Minnesota, we've had some folks show up in camouflage, and it is the right to openly carry weapons. Some would say that that might be pulling some parties further to extremes. I'm curious how you are seeing this moment from a political perspective. Are we having parties pull us to further extremes, either to the far left or to the far right?
That's a really interesting question, and some of that depends on, going to be a very academic here, what you mean by parties. But you know, the caucuses here in Minnesota are kind of a unique and interesting institution, but I do think one thing you see at the caucuses is a particular part of the party show up, and that's a very engaged activist base. And that's not surprising, right? You need to have a real motivation to get out on a snowy Tuesday and go to your local, you know, school or wherever it's being held. But I do think that one thing that has changed in politics is that the parties have come to increasingly be dominated by people for whom politics is a part of their identity, and some people refer to this as political hobbyism. And so a lot of the times those people care a lot more about sort of, you know, yelling loudly and being right, as opposed to actually solving the kinds of policy issues that the mayor is talking about. So I think that's a big part of it. I think another big part of it is just the nationalization of politics. So hearing a local mayor say that this is the bane of her existence is really not surprising, but that matches up that because politics has become so nationalized, and we seem to only be able to think through issues through a very national lens, that's grown to produce more polarization. But it also means that people are coming back to their communities and dealing with community issues not based on sort of knowing what's going on in their community, but based on these big national ideological frames that they're used to reading about in national media. And I can understand why that's really frustrating to have to deal with as a local government leader.
No, I appreciate that. And again, here, I think today there was an announcement of a third party, and we'll come back to whether we should be going down a route of third parties, but let me just note that there was an announcement for a third party to announce someone running for governor. So it's going to be a big reveal later today on that. So we'll wait to see who that potentially could be. Dan, I appreciate you talking about mayors and some of the challenges And I don't think the mayor here on the panel fits within this category, but when I was at the state legislature and we were talking about bonding issues, one of the mayors from a very small town, much smaller than Richfield, was making the case of the need to upgrade the sewer system because one of the things that he was doing was crawling down into the sewer system in his town so he could give a first-hand account. So again, want to make sure that we're very clear, not all mayors are doing it a full-time job. Many are doing it as a part-time job. So this challenge of the push and the pull, how do you, Madam Mayor, sort of resolve that tension within that space?
That's a very difficult answer. But I will say, so the majority of mayors in the country and the majority of local elected officials are part-time stipend, like my position. I get paid about $10,000 to be mayor for a year. And it's a 4-year term. And so most cities have city council and city manager form of government, because when that decision was made many years ago, it was, the ideology behind it was to protect our democracy and have, stability in government for the folks that are running the city, plowing the streets, giving you your water. We want consistency in that level of government. But what it looks like today for a millennial woman, Latina person to be in that role is nearly impossible. And if you look at who the mayors are in our cities, you do not see young women of color, and there's a reason, because we need to work full time and we have families to run and we have communities outside of our role of mayor that we are also leading. And when you have this role, especially with an identity like mine, you have expectations from kind of the status quo folks of what they're used to, expectations from your own community that has never had access to local government and power in their community, and now they do. And there's then, oftentimes a lot of deferred maintenance as it relates to equity issues and just bringing us up to speed. And so I think the way that I govern in this contradiction is to be very clear about what I am focused on, and that is leading a community where people feel welcomed and included, and not changing the core services of what local government does. We will be focused on, roads and infrastructure, but changing how we do that to meet the needs of our community today. And so when I know why I'm doing the work that I'm doing and what values that is rooted in, it makes it much easier, very easy, I guess, to make hard decisions. It's not fun to do that, but it makes it easy because I'm very clear about what my focus is. So I'm not constantly getting pulled or pushed and pulled by the polls. I stay clear on that focus.
Thank you very much. Bonnie, you have done some writing as well, sort of in another sphere, not just in politics, or maybe there's a different form of politics within religion. I'm curious as to what you have seen there as leaders in the faith community have tried to find a middle, and also within congregations or parishioners, or as the case may be.
Yeah, I think the single most significant thing that I would say to that is that as I've been writing about sort of like the confusing information environment that we have, and like political polarization and misinformation, and these things, of course, are all very connected, I keep running into almost the same comment, like it's bizarrely similar from pastors again and again, and it's always something to the effect of, I get my congregants an hour a week, but their favorite cable news show gets them 15 hours a week, or their favorite podcast gets them 20 hours a week, or social media gets them 40 hours a week, and I literally can't compete with that. Like, it doesn't matter if I preach the best sermon. It doesn't matter, like, how much I care for them and engaged with their lives. Like, if they are being much more formed as people by these media sources, there's just no competition in terms of the sheer hours. And that, I think, is a very widespread problem that a lot of faith communities are dealing with, where there's just like, this is supposed to be such a major part of your life, but for many people, politics and fighting about politics, especially online, has really seeped in and taken that place. And so, yeah, there's a lot of tension in a lot of congregations now, I think, over political things. People leave, people, move to a new place and then can't seem to find a church or a community that they feel at home in because of, it's one thing if you sort of have been somewhere a long time and you get used to it and you know those people, but to come into a new congregation with like political differences from you, that's hard. And so I think it's a big problem, and that issue of where we put our attention and where we spend our time is so closely related to it, and something that's very difficult to sort of force a change. Like a pastor can't say get off Twitter and like enforce that, right? It has to be something that we are all taking inventories of our own time, and that's not necessarily something that we want to do.
Do you mind if I ask you a follow-up within that? Just
Sure.
sort of the idea of the pastor can't say this, but is there a role for government to sort of come in and sort of regulate, especially what some might refer to as false information?
I mean, I would say no. I lean towards like free speech absolutism, as we talked about a little bit while we were planning for this. I think there are a lot of really bad things that I don't want the government to regulate, that I think adults need to make their own choices and take responsibility for their own lives. I would include, for example, currently illegal drugs in that. But that doesn't change how bad and how dangerous things like social media can be. Like, just because I don't think it should be illegal doesn't mean that it's not a huge, I would say, duty to get a hold of ourselves and like develop real virtue in this area, like cultivate habits of virtue and integrity and of guiding our attention towards better things. And so, you know, part of my doubt about federal regulation of it or any sort of government regulation is I don't think pragmatically that it could be effective, and I think it would have huge unintended consequences, civil liberties violations, massive expansions of like the carceral state to try to regulate this in our lives in any meaningful sense, especially with consequences that would change people's behavior. But none of that doubt about regulation is at all to undercut the seriousness of how corrosive this stuff is in many of our lives.
I appreciate that. But so I'm listening to you say this, so I'm thinking of some of the things that I've had a chance to talk to Dan with a little bit here. And that is this idea, if we're not regulating the speech, it can still have a corrosive effect within political parties. So I'm wondering, how do parties kind of deal with this issue? Well, I'll just stop there. I won't ask the compound question.
Oh, is this for him?
This is for Dan, yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question, and just to touch on something, I think the idea of cultivating virtue and sort of trying to remake our own social spheres so that they're less dependent on these very, I think very toxic, people might disagree, social media venues, is important. That is something though that needs to start at the community level, and so your pastor can't make you get off Twitter, but I do think we need to think about how those kinds of communities can help nudge people away from the kind of vitriolic communication that people are exposed to. I think the political parties have some role in that. I think it was Keith Ellison who, after the 2016 election, said, I'm going to get this quote a little bit wrong, but something along the lines of, stop yelling at people on Twitter, it's probably a Russian bot anyways. But there are limits to what political leaders can do. Political leaders are in a lot of ways sort of products of the political environment that produces them, and so I think that the success of less online politicians like Joe Biden, for example, I think should tell us something about the role that getting out of those information environments can play, and maybe bringing us back to reality. But I think it is something that has to start in the non-online communities that people participate in.
I also want to remind the audience to make sure that you send questions for the panelists. Several questions have come in. I'll start asking some of those questions. But before I do, Dan, I want to kind of come back to something the mayor had said about the idea that candidates need to raise money, have money to be able to support themselves going forward. Both you and Bonnie kind of mentioned this idea of, you use the term hobby, hobbyist. So all of a sudden now we see a meshing maybe of media, entertainment, and if I can say something very provocative, I might be able to raise a lot of money and be able to make myself a much more viable political candidate. What do we do in such a situation? Because that seems it might have a negative impact, actually get into the great policy that the mayor would like to get to.
Yeah, I think it's a big issue. Some of this has to do with the nationalization of media and politics, and you know, meaning no offense to the weak, but I think it's a problem that most people get their news from national outlets now, because to break through and to make what you say relevant to a big audience like that, sometimes you have to be sensationalistic or extreme. The issue of you know, certainly there's a market out there, as we've seen in terms of the political marketplace, for people who will say how crazy and dangerous things, and you know, dangerous not in the way that to be clear, that I think the government should censor, but and I think those people get a lot of attention and can build sort of a niche political career on that. But you know, what the mayor said, I think part of it is also just how we think about supporting public servants and viewing public service as a virtue, as a good thing to do. I think one product of the polarization that we've seen and the withdrawal of a lot of the public from politics, because it's people don't like it, is a kind of anti-politics, and so people don't want mayors to make any money because, you know, they're part of government and government is bad. People don't want to see Congress have a reasonable amount of staffing, or congressional staffers get paid a reasonable amount of money, because they don't think they hate Congress. And that leads to an environment where you have a very small group of people who have the free time and money to serve in public service. And a lot of people who even have that kind of free time and money don't want to do it, because, you know, who do you want to be a school board member and have people coming and yelling at you about masks and critical race theory all the time? That doesn't sound very attractive to me. So I think part of this is about supporting and building a different vision of remembering that public service is a public good, and is something that we should support, both financially but also socially, with respect.
Well, I appreciate that comment, especially supporting financially. I have a feeling that school board members make far less than $10,000. The joy of sometimes getting yelled at school board meetings. One of the questions that came in, is there a percentage which is hard left, middle, or hard right? And I'm curious, from each of your perspectives, how do we even know what these terms mean? Sometimes people will talk about hard left, right, conservative, liberal. How do you make your way through it, and how should we maybe make our way through it? Madam Mayor, do you mind if I start with you?
Can you ask the question again? How do I understand
Sure.
how that's broken up, essentially?
Yeah, so the question is there a percentage which is hard left, middle, and hard right? And I think this sort of begs the question, right? So we can think of this locally, we can think in the state or across the country. And then I think, do we even have common terms, right, of how we understand this?
So that's a hard question to answer. I definitely don't have percentages on what I think we have. I think we have a lot of confused people politically, and a lot of people who are confused about themselves in general. So when you don't know who you are and you haven't taken the time to do that work, and you're not living necessarily in alignment with that because you haven't done the work to figure that out, I think you are easily swayed to spend money on whatever the commercial is about, or do whatever your neighbor's saying, or, you know. And so I think that's probably, like, I don't know, 99% of our country. percentage, confuse folks. So, and I also think that people are afraid. There's a lot of bullying going on, and people bully and are very loud and build that culture of being in a camp, and they shame other people if they're not in that camp. So I think there's also a lot of people who are afraid to identify who they are and what they believe in, and then to vocalize that, given this bully culture that we have in our country. So I feel like that's the largest percentage of folks that we have.
Bonnie, if I could, I'm going to tag on, because here's the second part of that question. Is the middle really missing, or is it just overshadowed by the hard right and hard left? And I guess in some ways we could say, is there so much bullying going on by quote unquote the hard right or quote unquote the hard left that the middle can't show up?
Yeah, I mean, I'd start with two caveats. One is, I think you're right that a lot of people are not actually that ideological politically. A lot of people haven't really thought things through in a very systematic way. They're voting sort of based on gut feelings and like cultural alignment. And, you know, this is why we talk about like, who do you want to have a beer with from the presidential candidates? Because that is, I mean, that is how many people do think about politics. Like it's really not so partisan in the sense of like about policy. And the other qualifier I would say is that I think you can very easily get a false impression if you are very online that like the whole world is divided between like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Marjorie Taylor Greene, and that's extremely not the case. What I would say in terms of where people actually are and where the middle is maybe you guys have seen, there's a chart called the Nolan chart. That's one name for it. It's like four quadrants with an x-axis and a y-axis. And so it sorts people according to conservative or liberal economically and conservative or liberal socially. Foreign policy sort of gets short shrift. But so you get each of the four possible combinations. And the way polling has been on this in the last few years, especially since the Trump years, is that you get people around like high 20 percentages in the socially conservative and economically conservative corner. You get around the same amount in economically liberal and socially liberal. The economically conservative and socially liberal, or what we could call libertarian, that group is what we traditionally, especially in Washington, tend to talk about sort of in like a light, less strong version, but that's what a lot of times people mean when they say centrist, sort of like that fusionist consensus from like the 90s. But that group these days is really only like maybe 15%. It's much smaller. And then where the rest of the people, the other like upper 20s%, is in that other corner, economically liberal but socially conservative. And this is where you see a lot of people who would say that they feel like there is no representation for them, that there is like this missing middle sense. And that is where you see people like Donald Trump doing quite well, frankly, because he wants to have he's not really a free market guy, whatever he says. Like he likes a lot of trade interventionism. He'll talk about breaking up big companies, regulating Facebook, doing a lot of government intervention in the market, very much for Social Security, Medicare, talks up a lot of entitlement stuff, but then also plays to the more social conservative side of things. And so if we're saying like sort of where is the middle voter, right now that's where they are. It's, what do you call those people? I don't know. A lot of people will call them populists. I think that's sort of a misnomer. A lot of our terms to that second question are really scrambled right now, where, you know, like I struggle in my writing frequently to even say conservative, because many of the people on the right these days, they're not conservatives in the older sense. They're not trying to conserve anything. They're not about like prudence and temperance and tradition. They're about like owning the libs and trolling. And so I will generally refer to them as right-wing because they're right. They're anti-left. They're not conservative, and our words are a big mess right now.
So, Professor, can you help us make sense of this mess that we've gotten ourselves in? How do we just, move forward in this space?
You know, I think I second a lot of what Bonnie said about particularly who the middle is. You know, I say this to people and people look at me like I'm crazy, but voters perceive Donald Trump as moderate, and they in 2016, and the voters perceived Donald Trump as moderate because he broke from orthodoxy on the Republican Party on a lot of economic issues that that to the extent people have political opinions or things that they care about, Social Security and being a big one there. So I do think there's a mismatch between the conversation that happens in a lot of elite circles. You want to call them, I don't know, maybe the like Donald Trump conservatives, or the the vast number of newspaper columnists who are Republican anti-Trump, and probably everyone who's a Republican anti-Trump is a newspaper columnist. Not quite, Matt. That's an oversimplification, but yeah, I think that's right about where the middle is, and but I think another divide that's worth talking about, and I think in some ways more important, is the middle in terms of how engaged people are in government. Again, echoing what was just said, the average person, and this can be hard for people who attend an IAS event about politics, much less speak at one. Most people don't care about politics all that much. Most people are not terribly engaged. They don't have strong policy opinions because it's not terribly relevant to their day-to-day lives. And so that middle, I think, occasionally looks at politics, or has the one relative who posts stuff on their Facebook feed about politics, and it looks terrible to them. And so I think part of what has happened is that you've got a very engaged minority that, again, I say hobbyists, but it's sort of their passion is being involved in politics, and a lot of people who look and see that and don't have very strong opinions about policy. I don't think they would be anywhere on that Nolan chart in a reliable way. And they just want to check out. They might vote because someone harasses them into voting, but they're not going to get engaged in any deeper way. My favorite recent political scientist book, it's called The Other Divide, political scientist Yana Kripnikov. But the cover is just a person going like this, just plugging their ears. And I think that's actually a pretty good description of how a lot of people feel about politics right now.
I really appreciate that. Sometimes we forget, sometimes in our bubbles, especially maybe some of the folks here on stage or some of the folks in the audience, how much we know about the political system. We did some research when we were thinking about doing more civic engagement, engaging more citizens. I always was struck by the Pew Center research paper, which said 1 in 3 Americans could not name all 3 branches of government. So again, just to center us, right? Madam Mayor, I think there's a question that's come in for you. I'd like, let's see. Oh, here it is. It seems compromise is now considered a bad thing. Do you have any concrete ideas about how to make the concept of political compromise popular again?
In terms of making it popular, no. I think anything I've said today does not sound popular or exciting, because it's straight up like governance, good governance, and that's not of interest, I feel like, to a lot of people. But I think creating a space where everybody can feel heard is a big part of that compromise, and creating a collective vision that can hold multiple perspectives. It is a big part of compromise. I think when I make decisions as a policymaker, I think of all these different considerations, and you have to take all the short-term impacts, the long-term impacts, financial impacts, sustainability impacts, equity impacts. And I think it's less about, the way that I think about it is less compromise, like, okay, you guys got something you want, and you got something you want, and that's the best thing. I don't necessarily think that's the best thing, per se, just because everybody compromised. I think about it as, how do we create policy and a future for our community that has the most benefit at the least cost for the most amount of people, and that is going to be setting the trajectory for 30 to 50 years out into the future. That's what my charge is. I'm not building a road just for today. I'm building it for 30 to 50 years out as well. And so, you know, even just that concept for me of compromise is like, can be, people use that to say like, well, as long as I get a little piece and they lost a little, I'm fine. It's more complex than that. And so I think it's about thinking about all these different considerations, and it will mean compromise, but not coming at it from that perspective.
Well, and I think that also assumes that we all come to political disputes in the same economic position, right? Because if I have more and I split 50%, I continue my same economic advantage within that space. Bonnie, question for you. Do you think that empathetic listening and consideration of multiple sources tends to be polarizing, depolarizing, or does it depend on the person?
I think it probably significantly depends. There was a study, I want to say it was Gallup, but I might be getting that wrong, in the last couple of years, that found that people who read the news the most and people who were most likely to be posting political content on social media were the least well-informed. Like they were the most likely to have believed some misinformation. So they were very engaged and also more wrong on average. So I think there can be, like, you can do it too much, you can do it and have negative outcomes. That said, I mean, listening to other perspectives and engaging in them in good faith, I think to some degree it's sort of like that that famous Winston Churchill quote about democracy, where like it's terrible but it's better than all the other ones. And so in the same way, I would say, like, you know, it is terrible. It does come with some risk. It's generally, it's often not very pleasant to have to like give someone that you disagree with a fair shake and like really listen to their case and not just like wait for them to shut up so you can say your part. But is there something better? I don't really know that there is, except for maybe logging off completely.
Well, to that point, the Prime Minister, this idea that we've got to try all things in our democracy, but we'll finally come around to the right decision. Some would say that's sort of fearful at this point in time within our democracy. So there is a question that I'm going to put to you, Dan. Do you fear for our democracy? Have we kind of got to this point where we're very polarized? We may have had technology race ahead of us. The internet and being able to really understand it and how it softly manipulates, or maybe hardly, in a very hard way, manipulates our thinking. Is this a time for us to be fearing for our democracy?
You know, I want to be careful about language like that. I think part of what drives the overactive engagement among a minority of people, and also the tendency to, you know, view things through a particular ideological lens that you think is the solution, is driven by maybe overstating the dangers of any particular time. If you think the world is coming to an end, then you know you certainly don't have time to listen patiently to the other side. And you know, we've been through a lot as a country. I hear people talk like that, but I imagine if you transplanted them back to, you know, 1965, they would much less, you know, the South in 1875. We have been through hard times in this country before, and democracy in one form or another has survived. But I do think that there are some threats to that are driven largely by this sort of anti-politics aversion to thinking about government in terms of policy, that you know, historically you can point to a lot of kind of places where that leads to a desire for a strongman ruler. And you know, I think that is potentially a danger. But I do think it's good to sometimes to take a longer historical view of our current situation before we get too agitated. I think feeling too much anxiety is not good for thinking and carefully considering the other side.
You mean too much anxiety after a 100-year pandemic is not a good thing for us?
I think a lot of what's going on now we can just explain because the pandemic has made people strange, but yeah. The guy on Zoom saying that.
A question for you, Bonnie. How has the difference in where people get their politics or the political information from has affected polarization? And is there a generational difference? So, old person like myself, they can look, I can't make sense of this. My teenage sons are in their early 20s. They may come with more suspicion as relates to what they see on the internet.
Yeah, I mean, so obviously one big story related to that is just like the fragmentation of media. So if you go back to the 80s and earlier, we've got like ABC, NBC, CBS. That's pretty much it. You've got your local paper. But everybody is much more receiving their news from the same place. And when there were so few outlets and they're trying to appeal to a national audience, the approach they took was sort of very bland, very centrist, like we're just going to give you the facts, we're going to try to appeal to as many people as possible. Obviously, since the rise of the internet and other options for like self-publishing and distributing information on a smaller scale, it becomes much, much more tailored. And so it is very easy to get news that pretty much is, and commentary especially, that is like what you want to hear, and you don't have to listen to anyone else if you don't want to. And with social media, like you can micro-target like articles to go to people who will definitely like them if you want to. This was a thing with the Trump campaign in 2016. Like they were doing like crazy micro targeting on Facebook where you can select by demographics for different people to see different messages. And so we really can be like in the same networks but experiencing totally different information online, even though we all think we're in Facebook or Twitter or wherever together. As far as generational differences, I think there are a few. For older folks, definitely older generations are far more likely to get their news from like cable, from television, than younger generations are. The average viewership of like Fox is like 85. I'm maybe exaggerating a little bit, but not much. Like it, and that is, and is also quite old, older than you would think for the other channels. It's not just Fox, so I want to say they're the oldest. There's also a correlation of age and sharing false, like misinformation on social media. That's the one demographic, more than political affiliation actually, that correlates with sharing it. And that's not to suggest that younger folks are innocent of it at all. They're not, but there is a correlation there. Beyond that, though, I would say I think with younger people, maybe there's a bit more of like a nihilism and like a, I can't fix this. We're going to have 75, 80-year-olds who have been in Congress for 20 years in charge forever. And so there's more like maybe like a checking out or approaching politics in sort of like a memey, jokey way where like it's not really that serious and you're just like having fun online because you know you'll never have any power to actually fix things anyway.
Thank you for that, Madam Mayor. I think this question is for you. What do you see as one of the more effective current venues for genuine debate? What do you see as effective venues for genuine debate?
I don't know if there's a lot of this out there, but I think it goes back to connecting in person in your community and building trust again across groups different from yourself. That is how I see, and you know, one person that I think about that talks about this all the time is Brene Brown and all the work that she's done. But that concept, it's what I see, and it's what I see in my role. This is a funny story, actually. I'm gonna make it a little funny. So when I first ran for office and got elected as mayor, you know, there was a whole constituency that maybe didn't vote for me or were not happy that I was the one that was gonna be their mayor. So what did I do? I said, do you wanna have coffee with me? I'd love to invite you to coffee and talk to you. And that whole saying about it's hard to hate up close, that is so true, and I use it all the time. I call up the haters and I'm like, hey, let's have a talk, let's have coffee. But just if you take that concept and you apply it, it's hard to hate up close. And so I think that building that personal, real connection between people and not coming in with an agenda, but saying like, you know, when I did that, I said, I know you care about the city. I know you have done so much work and are committed to our community. I want to learn more about your perspective and your thoughts and how you think we can work forward, or how we can work together to move that forward. I'm here to partner. So I'm not going to come to the table with a specific ideology or point that I want to make, but I'm going to start with, I want to build a relationship with you first, and I want to learn your perspective, and just leaving it at that. That is what I've seen for myself as extremely effective. I would say probably every single time I've done it, and I've done it many times, it works really well, and I make great allies across difference. And I've seen communities, when communities do that with groups, that's something that I really believe in and think is effective.
I really appreciate that story. I think one of the things which surprised me after I was appointed by Governor Dayton to an office, I had a list of 20 people that I was supposed to call that were on the other side of the political aisle from him. So that was not what I thought was going to be job one, right? Question for you, Bonnie. How do the words of Dr. King, who stated that the moderate is actually the oppressor, resonate with the contemporary context? So the idea of the letter from the Birmingham jail, and the idea that what is frustrating opportunities for African Americans to really see themselves is the unwillingness of the white moderate to upset the status quo.
Yeah, I think I want to say it depends. I think if we're looking at sort of national politics, where everything is so increasingly happening along party lines, and you know, in that case, I'm guessing the white moderates we're talking about would be like Democratic Party leadership, who are more towards not quite. I mean, moderate might be a little bit of a stretch. I guess it depends on the perspective of the person labeling them moderates. But
Yeah, and just for context, right? President Johnson said that the Democrats might lose the South to go along, and I think we can go back to the 30s when another one of University of Minnesota's very proud sons, Roy Wilkins, was writing as relates to lynching legislation, and couldn't get Franklin Delano Roosevelt to engage with Democrats on that issue, just to give context to this.
sure, yeah. I mean, right now, I think that, so I'm speaking about the Democratic Party because my assumption from the phrasing of the question is that the bulk of the Republican Party at the national level is probably like so far removed from the agenda that is desired here. But I think that this is an ongoing fight within the Democratic Party right now of are they going to move sort of leftward, and like particularly with this past election, this idea of like, was it the fault of the left wing of the party, people who were saying things like defund the police, people who wanted more radical policies and more radical changes? Is it their fault that the gains in Congress were not as big as they wanted? Is it their fault that it looks like they're probably going to do poorly in this upcoming midterms because did they sort of scare off the median voters with this more radical language? And you know, maybe the party leadership was right in wanting to take this more moderate or widely palatable approach. I think, you know, in terms of the moderate being the oppressor, I guess the question that, and this is part of why I'm not in politics, the question is, like, given the realities of like where the voting public is and what people are going to vote for, do you stake out that more radical choice? And maybe in some cases that is actually what you want, but you know you're not going to win and make more incremental changes if you do that. And so, yeah, I mean, I guess I can say yes. I think that the party and the voting public, like both the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, but also just the broader voting public, is not in a space to vote for bigger changes.
No, I appreciate it. I should have told you that this audience sometimes asks very difficult questions. So, Dan, I want to throw a couple of questions to you that have come in about restructuring or tinkering with the political process. But I also just want to take a moment and again encourage you to send questions, and I can then forward those on to the panelists. Appreciate all the questions which have come in here. Picking up on where Bonnie left off here, The question is, what's the prospects for a viable third political party in Minnesota or nationally? And again, there are some folks that might say, we read Brown versus Board of Education and we see language in there from the Supreme Court moving at a pace of all deliberate speed. And if you read that, that just means moving at a pace that just maintains the status quo, doesn't upset the status quo, which is not really vibrant change. So this idea, do we need a third party in Minnesota or nationally to kind of move things forward for some communities? No, you're off the hot seat. I'm going to put the professor on the hot seat.
No, I'm interested what she thinks, because this is, of course, the big question that always comes up when you talk about the missing, whatever part of. I think there's American politics are structurally set up so that it's very difficult to achieve change via outside the two-party system. If you want to do that, you first need to change us to a system of proportional representation. Change us to all ranked choice voting for executive offices, and so on. I think, though, that the good thing about the American party system is that the American parties are much more permeable than I think a lot of people appreciate. The Americans' parties are much less structured, much less organized than parties in a lot of countries. They do not demand that you vote the party line every single time in Congress, much as it may seem that they do. And new groups can emerge and have influence within parties by showing that they represent a sizable amount of people who are committed enough to engage in politics. And so and from the other side of where the second part of your question was, but Donald Trump is the best example of that. He did a hostile takeover of the Republican Party and showed that there was a constituency out there for what he was selling. I think actually that a lot of the people politicians that we think of, or voices that we think of on the left, recognize this. AOC didn't start a third party to run for Congress. She took over the Democratic Party in Queens. Bernie Sanders may insist that he's an independent, but functionally in every way, he acts like a good Democrat senator, and sees his role as pushing that party to the left to the extent that he can. And so I think if you feel unrepresented by the two-party system, the solution is to start getting engaged in the party that you want to convince to move in your direction. And the other thing about third parties is I think people, in any kind of a political system, to change policy, you need to get to 51%, or in any kind of a democratic political system. And so you might feel better about yourself if you vote, for a socialist party or a populist party or a hard right-wing party. But if that party has, if you can't convince a coalition of 51% of the people in the country to support whatever it is that you're trying to achieve, you're not going to achieve that. So I think that's the real thing about the sort of third party pipe dream. It's often more about a desire for personal purity and how you're voting, as opposed to actually wanting to achieve policy change.
Can I respond to that real quick?
Sure.
I was just going to say that I think you're absolutely right about the structural realities and like the huge changes to how we vote and how our whole system of governance is organized for third parties to become viable. And that reality of having to go into one of the two major parties if you realistically want a chance at a national political career is like the constraint that I was getting at in my awkward answer. That like that feeling of people on the left.
It was a great answer.
But that feeling of people on the left that they're sort of like beholden to this elderly, mostly white, like been in office for 30 years establishment with whom they don't really agree, but they don't have another option. And so like I would love to have third parties. I would love to have like a more viable array of options. But I think that one of the reasons that I don't think we will in my lifetime is that it would require us to say like, we are going to trust each other enough to start a new system and trust that it's going to come out better than what we have right now. And nobody trusts each other, and so we're much more content to stick with the devil we know.
So one of the questions here is postulating that devil we know, maybe of change, final five voting. Professor, can you explain what final five voting is? And could this be, short of third parties, an alternative which might address these issues?
So I'm actually going to admit that I believe that is a flavor of ranked choice voting, and so that someone can correct me if I'm wrong. There's a lot of different schemes for alternative voting systems. And I do think that to some degree these can help address some of the issues that we see in the political system, in the current system. I think Minneapolis's mayoral elections have attracted a wider variety of candidates in recent years because of ranked choice voting. I think that I believe that there is a system, something like this in Alaska, where it's top four primary winners and move on to the general election. I'm gonna get the details wrong there, but I think that that's allowed, say, Lisa Murkowski the ability to be a more centrist Republican and not worry about a hard right primary electorate. So I think there's definitely possibilities for institutional change that can do some stuff. I do think, though, that some of this is tinkering around the edges, that your democratic system is going to reflect the underlying distribution of people and the character of the country, to get back to something Bonnie said about virtue. And if that's not so good, then these institutional tweaks are only going to be able to do so much around the edges.
That would be great.
I am all for getting involved locally and bucking both parties. So when I ran for office, there was a Democratic candidate that was groomed, the next appointed anointed person, to be in that seat, in the city council seat. They were endorsed by every single council member. They were a part of the school PTO, all these different things. And when I decided that I wanted to run for office as a city council member, people laughed in my face and they said, "You're not from the party. You've never been to the Senate district meetings. We don't know who you are. You will never win." And Keith Ellison is a friend and a mentor of mine, and he taught me, and as a fellow organizer, he taught me to reach out to my own community members that have consistently been left out of this whole process, and so many other community members more that have also been left out, and to focus, to provide that connection to the voter that is going to vote for a local elected office. But that was a small piece of my campaign strategy, and it's a very small piece of my leadership strategy. I don't spend time, my physical time, in spaces where existing infrastructure and civic infrastructure already exist. They've got their bases covered, they're good to go. I'm gonna spend my time in spaces where our community members have been left out of this process. And by doing so, I won with almost 60% of the vote when I was told that I didn't have a viable chance. And then I won again when people said that for mayor I would never make it. So I just want to tell people that, and I don't know that that's a viable option for federal, higher office, because you've got to get jumped into one of the two mafias, whether you like it or not. But locally, you can do this. And I see community members building leadership and civic infrastructure across so many communities that have been left out. And that is a way that I do think we can change our political system. I'm not going to speak for higher office because it's a whole different ballgame, but locally, where I believe we have the most ability to make change, it's the closest level of government to people. That's where I think we can really change and change the political dynamics outside of the two-party system, and do so in a way that is not focused on a political platform, but working together to figure out what's best for our community.
I think that's a nice lead into this question, Bonnie, kind of on a national level here. Would you argue that it's important that the Democratic Party bring in the new left, leave that to you as defining that new left, rather than continuing losing strategies seen with Terry McAuliffe of Virginia?
That is a tough call, and I do not know that I know enough about the state of the Democratic Party to like really give a competent answer to that. The most of the time when I'm writing about like a party, I'm usually commenting on the Republicans more. It's just more of my beat, if you will. I think this is an active debate within the Democratic Party, and something that like there are major constituencies for both sides, and so obviously, with the last election, with Biden winning, representing the more moderate faction, that side of things sort of seems to be in control once more. I think a lot of the youthful energy definitely is further left, but it remains to be seen, and I think it remains to be decided within the party whether those younger, further left folks are, number one, willing to like play by the rules and like learn what they have to do to actually gain power within the party. This was a big problem with the Sanders people in 2016. They, at their convention, and as they were like leading up to the convention, they felt that they were like really ripped off and like being taken advantage of by the more experienced party activists. And it was because they went in not really understanding how the party rules worked, and it's like very arcane, and you have to like do a whole bunch of complicated stuff. And so I think it remains to be seen whether people actually want to like do that work and spend time paying their dues essentially, in hopes of someday in the future pulling the party more to their space. And I also, like, again, going back to the subject of like the political realities of where the electorate is and having to win 51%, I do not think there is a slam dunk case that bringing the party far left is going to win you more elections. In some districts, absolutely. But on the national scale, I think right now, that's probably not the winning strategy.
So Dan, kind of echoing what the mayor said and building off of what Bonnie said here, why are we not focusing on a more unified purpose for America? Why aren't we thinking, I think this is a reverse engineering kind of question, backwards from the pursuit of happiness within our politics?
I think the way I'd like to answer that question is in terms of the identities that people bring to politics, and the way that people think of themselves in a political space. And I do think that part of the problem is that there is less of an identification with sort of the kind of good engaged citizenship that we all learned about in high school civics class, and more of an identification as a partisan. But I think part of the problem too, and I think this is something that's important to recognize, because it is that there are real disagreements about what that phrase means, and I don't think it. I think it's actively harmful, in fact, to pretend that there's one answer out there that is going to make everybody happy. There's disagreement in politics because people have very different ideas of what government should do, and what a good life looks like, and how government should or should not help people achieve that. And so I think some of what the mayor said about talking to lots of different groups who have different ideas about what should be done, and compromise not being splitting the difference between them, but recognizing that you can try to find a solution that makes more people happy, but that people will probably not all be happy with what you do, and that's okay. I think we need to be more comfortable with disagreement, that we shouldn't see the fact that someone disagrees with us as a sign that they are terrible. But a term that political philosophers use called the economization of moral disagreement. And the idea is that we're always going to have moral disagreement, but we should try to find solutions, not that do away with that, but that limit, try to limit that, try to get as good as we can, even if we're never going to agree on basic moral questions, and what the pursuit of happiness means and what enables that.
So just a follow-up question within that space, because it triggered something I was thinking concerning a quote from Dr. King about the absence of tension does not mean justice. exist. So how do we square that kind of concept to what you're talking about as well, is about living with contradiction and tension within? Because as a parent, I know that tension exists, but it doesn't mean I don't love my kids, but there's going to be some tension from time to time.
Yes, and I think part of that, and I think the part that's maybe relevant to the quote from Dr. King, is making sure that everybody has a seat at the table. You know, part of the one reason you might not see contradiction and tension is because the people who would introduce contradiction and tension are kept away from the conversation. And you know, that's very much the reality, the political reality that he was operating in the South in the 1960s, and is, you know, probably not true to that extent, but still true today in a lot of places. But I think the broader point that a different point sort of is that the existence of tension is not evidence of injustice. It's evidence that democracy is happening.
Madam Mayor, do you want to say something?
I was just going to make a joke and say, and because we live in Minnesota, you don't see a lot of tension and disagreement.
To a contemporary challenge, and one of the questions posed here is that sometimes it's important to stand a position and not seek to moderate because the stakes are so high. So one of the issues that's predominating, I would say, in the public square is what should we do on, some people refer to as climate change, some folks would view it as climate instability. Madam Mayor, it doesn't have to be climate change, but I'm curious, when you are positioning as a leader, when you see an issue in that way, how do you navigate as a political leader?
This is something that where my identity as a bicultural person really comes into play into my civic leadership. People think that, you know, like if being a mayor or being in politics or being in a governing role, you are you know, I have friends that are like, you sold out, you're selling out, you know, you're a politician now. You're trying to bring multiple groups of people together. And they, again, that's the left wanting to see me be a certain way. But what I know as a biracial Midwestern Mexicana Chicana is that that's not what it is. I am very clear about my values. I am very clear about what I'm doing and why. And it is about communicating those values in a way that somebody else can understand, not shoving my perspective down somebody's throat in the way that I think that they should understand it from my reality. And this has to do with cross-cultural communication and that ability to speak to people in a way that they can understand. But you're communicating your values, but you're doing so, and that's called code switching. And so that's something that I use all the time, is code switching. I'm not losing my values. I'm communicating it in a way where somebody else different from me might be able to hear it.
All right. I see that we have 5 minutes, and I have more than 5 questions here. So what I'm going to do is thank the audience for submitting the questions. Dan, I think you're going to be off the hook. If there are questions from folks that are here in the audience, please come up to the stage. Hopefully Bonnie and the mayor will take a minute or two to be able to answer those additional questions that I was just not able to get to. But what I would like to do in this final couple of minutes is ask each of you, if you were, from your lens, from your perspective, how do we move forward kind of in this polarizing time, and what would you give your neighbor, a loved one, a piece of advice in moving forward? And Bonnie, I'm going to start with you.
I don't want to steal your thunder, but I think your emphasis on doing things in person and focusing on your local community and things in your real life is huge. You know, I work at an online national media outlet. Maybe read us less, read everyone less, do less things online, get less wrapped up in things that have nothing to do with you, that you can't fix. I know it feels like everything is really imminent and everything is really like involved in your life, and like the, every appointment and every bill passage and so on is going to change your life. In reality, though, it's true that a lot of what actually affects your life day to day in terms of politics and governance is far more local or state level. Like most of our interactions with government are not with the federal government. And so, I mean, part of why I work in as an opinion writer and not in politics is because I get to just like write my pure unfiltered opinion, and I try to make it persuasive and stuff, but I don't have to do sort of that difficult negotiation. And I think that there is a space for that, obviously, because I do it, and there's a space for thinking about these ideas, and hopefully doing that in like a productive way. But the allure of this and the way that we're sort of like addicted to fighting each other, and sort of like really have this bloodlust for political argument, I think it's hard to overstate how bad that is, and how much we do need to be like logging off and having normal conversations about like dogs, pets, kids, vacation, jobs, like just things in your real life with real people.
But not your website, though.
Theweek.com should be your one exception.
Madam Mayor, what piece of advice would you give us?
I would just echo what was said. And, get involved in your own community, on your block, in your neighborhood, in your community, and just focus on community building, getting to know people and leaders and folks in your community, not for any agenda reason, but just to build that sense of connection and community. You're going to come across people so different from you. You're going to, just do the right thing and build community in your own backyard. And that is the most important. That's building civic infrastructure and engagement. That's what we need today. And so just get involved and don't bring that partisanship right now or that volatility. Just do something to build community in your neighborhood. It's amazing.
Thank you very much. Dan, final word?
Okay, that puts the stakes up. Well, I'll mostly just agree 80% with what was just said, that definitely log off, except for the week. Definitely, work in your local community and rebuild those local social ties, not just political ties. I think one of the effects of the pandemics is that, and this has been accelerating a much longer process, we just have fewer social ties to people who are different than us. And we need to rebuild those to function as a country. But I do, national politics exist and are important. And so I think part of this is thinking about how we can engage in national politics, and instead of bringing that national politics attitude down to the local level, trying to bring some of what we've been talking about at the local level up to the national level. And just, if you are, as I said, if you're somebody who's attending in something like this, you are way more politically engaged than the average American. So keep that in mind when you talk to your non-politically engaged friends. They're more normal than you are. But also keep in mind the attitude that you bring to consuming political information, to thinking about the other political side, trying to do that in a spirit of generosity, trying to give the other side the best possible, the most sympathetic possible reading, as opposed to the least sympathetic reading, trying to genuinely listen, and really recognize that a lot of the times the most engaged people are the problem. You may very well be part of the problem, but that means you can be part of the solution.
I appreciate that. The Minnesota Humanities Center, our vision is a just society that's curious, connected, and compassionate. When we talk about curiosity, coming to conversations with a true open heart and open mind to sincerely listen, authentically listen to one another. The idea that creates connection, and it allows us to get to shared understanding of one another so that we can move together beyond empathy toward action with compassion. I really appreciate the opportunity of this 6-part series with my good friends at the University of Minnesota. They kind of trusted me. I had never moderated before like this, so I really appreciated the opportunity. I also want your help in thanking our outstanding panelists for today. Bonnie, Madam Mayor, and Dan, thank you so very much. And if you could put your hands together and thank them, I'd appreciate it. So that does bring the end to the conclusion of the program. I know that there was a couple of questions I did not get to, so if there are individuals here in the audience that want to come down and ask those questions, we'll do so now. But otherwise, thank you, and hopefully our paths will cross again.